Okay, so the exam is tonight, or this afternoon, from 4:30 to 6 in Social Sciences 122. It's open everything except for no two-way messaging. Bring a calculator or a computer or something like that for sure. Bring all the notes from the classes for sure. Yeah. Any questions about the exam? Okay. So today we're going to apply monopoly theory to what I think is a very important social problem, which is the growing inequality both in the United States and in other developed countries. And we'll talk about why, even if you're a libertarian or a right-wing Republican or whatever, you might still be in favor of some redistribution of wealth. It basically acts as insurance against risks that you face in your life. And then we'll talk about redistribution, aiming to maximize expected utility, and in particular, that given that utility is concave, we usually think that people are risk averse. The poor value money more than the rich. This will give a reason for redistribution. That will then use this to analyze optimal taxation, both sort of the average tax rate that an ordinary American should pay, which will calibrate using a logistic distribution of income, and then a special surcharge tax for the rich, which President Obama has recently proposed. And we'll calibrate that using a Pareto distribution of income at the top end of the spectrum. And we'll talk about some of the additional concerns that this analysis ignores. Okay, so income inequality, that is differences in income across different people in a society, comes in three basic forms. So the first is poverty, that is people who are much less well off than everybody else is. And this is typically measured by the fraction of the population that's below some poverty line. The global poverty line is $1 per person per day. The U.S. poverty line is much, much higher. It's something around $19,000 for a family of four. So you can think of the poverty line not as being some absolute line that's just, where it is, but rather being no more than, say, half or less than the median income in the country. The interesting thing is that poverty, that form of inequality, has not been growing very much in recent years. So you hear a lot of discussion in the media about the growth in inequality, but inequality at the bottom end of the spectrum, poverty, has not been growing in recent years. A second type of inequality is often called mid-range inequality. This is sort of the difference between people who are sort of upper middle class and lower middle class. And this is typically measured by the Gini Coefficient. And I'll show you exactly what the Gini Coefficient is in a minute. And this has grown somewhat over time in the United States, but not dramatically. The final type of inequality is called top income shares. This is how much the top 10%, how much of total national income is taken by the top 10% or the top 1% of earners. And this has just absolutely skyrocketed in recent years. So let me show you some data so first let me show you what a Gini coefficient is. So this is the typical graph for the Gini coefficient. And what it shows is something called the Lorenz curve. This says, imagine we say, who is the person who's better off than 40% of people in the population? What fraction of income in total is earned by people below that level? So we take the bottom 40% of the population, how much of the total income in the country do they earn? And that might be, say, 5%. So then the Lorenz curve at 4.4 would be 0.05, right? And if we then say the bottom 60%, how much of the total income do they earn? Maybe that's 0.1, so then 0.6 would correspond to 0.1. And that would draw out this Lorenz curve, right? Now, if this were completely at a 45-degree line, that would say that the bottom 50% earn 50%, right? So that's perfect equality, right? To the extent that this is below that 45-degree line, there's inequality. And so the area between the line of equality and the Lorenz curve is the area A, and 2 times A is the Gini coefficient. Or that's the same as A over A plus 2. Okay. So inequality has been growing in the United States primarily in terms of the top income shares. So, as I said, the Gini coefficient hasn't gone up that much. Poverty hasn't gone up basically at all. It went up a little bit during the 1980s. It came down dramatically during the 1990s, and it stayed flat during the 2000s. But during this time, and the Gini has sort of been going up gradually, but there's been an absolute explosion in the fraction of national income taken by the top, the people at the very top. So this is a graph of it. The black represents the fraction of total national income taken by the top 1% of income earners. And during the just before the Great Depression, during the Roaring 20s, this went up to its historical peak of almost 25%. Then during the Great Depression, it came down. And then during all the New Deal and all the World War II reforms, it absolutely plummeted. So it went from 25% down below 10%. And then, starting in the late 70s and in the Reagan era, it's just steadily come up to the point where now it's almost back up at the level it was during the Roaring 20s. On the other hand, in Europe and Japan, it has not really gone up. So again, in the Roaring 20s, it was very high. It came way down, and it's just stayed down in France, the Netherlands, Japan, Germany, and Switzerland. Inequality has also been going up across countries. So the fraction of the world which is super rich has been steadily rising, while the fraction of the world that was super rich came way down and then has been rising again. The world Gini coefficient has sort of been gradually rising, whereas the fraction that are super rich in the United States again came way down and then started rising again. Okay. Now, many libertarians or right-wing conservatives are basically opposed to intervening to try to do anything about this. They say, and in fact, I used to be one of these people, so I empathize with their perspective. They basically say, the rich earned their money. Who has the right to take it away from them? Another argument is sort of social Darwinist. The rich people are, better, and we need to select for them. We need to give them the resources so they can do the things with the money. The poor will sort of piss away their money, and the rich will spend it on charities and socially important projects. Robert Nozick said that anyone who gets their money in a fair way deserves to be able to keep it. There's a sort of Protestant argument that wealthy people are the chosen people of God, and therefore they deserve the money. That's classic Calvinist view. Ayn Rand famously argues that sort of all taxation is violence, that property is inviolable, and the government has no right to take it away from people. There's also fascist arguments, like that, which you actually amazingly often hear in the American political system, which is that as soon as you start talking about things like redistribution, you sort of breed resentment between different classes of society, and that's bad. And that we all need to be united as Americans, and anytime you start talking about redistribution, that turns one American against another. I find very surprising that you hear that all the time in the media. You hear people accused of class warfare. That's like the most classic fascist argument against redistribution. So I think there's lots of other arguments that are sort of liberal or persuasive. I think that one is particularly bizarre and insidious. But another one is just conservative, which is that sort of every part of society has its role to play, and as you start redistributing, you undermine the roles that each part of society has to play. So many of these arguments, I think, are actually quite powerful, and we'll return to them later. They won't be considered in our analysis. Most of them haven't really been completely studied in economics or formalized. But I think that the most compelling reason to redistribute is basically a libertarian argument that should be, I think, persuasive to anyone, even who accepts a lot of the libertarian ideas of Rand or Nozick. And the idea is very similar to a very classic Christian saying from a famous preacher from the 17th century. So he said he saw poor people going by, and he said, "There, but for the grace of God, go I." That is, he could imagine that if he had been unlucky, if God hadn't been, hadn't blessed him, he would have ended up in those people's positions. And therefore, he wouldn't want to live in a society where people suffer that way, because he can imagine himself having been in their shoes. Right? And this is exactly the argument made by John Harsanyi and later, more famously, by John Rawls. He tried to give a sort of libertarian choice-based account of why we should redistribute wealth. And Alexandra?
Yeah.
What was John Harsanyi's argument?
It's based on choice.
Did anyone read the Harsanyi article? Yeah?
Well, he basically, I didn't understand it completely,
Yeah.
but it's the basic idea that you don't know what position you're going to end up in.
Yeah.
So he was comparing it to decisions that gamblers make, so it's almost like a calculated risk.
Yeah, exactly. Remind me of your name?
Michael.
What's your last name?
Bowler.
Was he the Veil of Ignorance guy?
He was the original Veil of Ignorance. He was before Rawls. So Rawls is famous for the Veil of Ignorance, but Harsanyi wrote that in 1950, and Rawls wrote it in 1975. So the basic idea is, people buy insurance for all sorts of things in their lives, right? They buy insurance against medical disasters. They buy insurance against car wrecks. They buy insurance against their house burning down. And that's because they value their money more if they don't have very much of it, and they don't want to be put into poverty, right? They'd rather give up a little bit every year to avoid the chance of being put into poverty. And that's basically because money is worth more to you when you're poor than when you're rich. Therefore, it seems natural if they buy, insurance against being having a medical disaster, it seems natural that they would buy insurance against being born into an incredibly poor family, right? Or against being born disabled, or something like that, right? But, of course, people can't buy insurance against things like that, right? They can't buy insurance against what family they're born into. They can't buy insurance about, whether they were born tall or short. And they can't do that for two reasons. One is that they're too young to buy the insurance against things that happen, during their lifetime until they get into their 20s or something like that, right? And second, they can't buy insurance against where they're born or to which parents they're born, because they're not born at that point, right? And so the argument of Harsanyi is that the government should act exactly as an insurance agent. It should offer people, it should, sell to people, basically, the insurance that they can't afford to purchase, or they're not able to purchase before they were born. And the way that it does that is by redistributing wealth from the rich to the poor, because that offers people insurance against being a poor person. And so the logic of that is that one should seek to maximize the expected utility of all people in the population, that is, the total utility that everyone gets, right? Because that